And a big story of breaking news from yesterday, the UFC announced that they have a new U.S. partnership for pay-per-view, and that now the only pay-per-view distributor in the United States of America is going to be ESPN Plus. So that means you can no longer get it through DirecTV or your cable package. It also means that UFC TV is not going to be an option for pay-per-views. And one of the more questionable things about it is that it looks as though, because ESPN Plus has the exclusivity here, that you have to have an ESPN Plus subscription to order a pay-per-view. So there was an interview that Mark Raimondi did with Lawrence Epstein, who's one of the top executives at the UFC, asking some more questions. So I'm going to go through that article and add my commentary onto that. So the first question that he basically asked was, how will this change the way that or how will this change the way fans in the USU pay-per-view events? He said pretty drastically, and then just kind of recap what I just mentioned before, where it's all going to be going through ESPN Plus. How much more is it going to cost? He's saying that depends on your current viewing patterns. As an ESPN Plus subscriber, it's going to cost you $5 a month or a yearly rate of $50. Now, just to put it out there, I have a yearly subscription to ESPN Plus. So I'm paying the $50. Pretty easy choice for me, just because, for one, ESPN, it seems as though with John Skipper no longer at the helm, it seems like they're starting it back to what made him good, which was more of a focus on sports and less on politics, which is good. But then on top of that, just from a sports standpoint, what they have with the UFC on its own for $50 a year, it's definitely worth it with all the cards you get. But I'm also a fan of some other sports too. I get a hockey game every night if I want. I get some of the big tennis tournaments. They have some college wrestling on there too from the ACC and some of the other conferences. Plus, they're also going to have the national tournament. So to me, ESPN Plus is a no-brainer. For some people, that may or may not be the case, especially if you already have Fight Pass and you're still paying for Fight Pass. I used to have Fight Pass, but once they made the announcement that they were switching over to ESPN, I was actually just kind of waiting until ESPN Plus came out to see if it would be worth me getting Fight Pass anymore. And I think at this point, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff on Fight Pass, especially with like the EBIs, the kickboxing they have on there, some decent local MMA. But to me, it just isn't worth it, especially with the value you can get out of ESPN Plus. But for some people, they didn't make that decision. They aren't paying the $50 a year. They aren't paying the $5 a month. And so if they want to buy a pay-per-view now, they're going to have to actually get ESPN Plus to do it. And they'll talk about the prices there too. I think it's kind of reasonable depending on what you're looking for. But to answer the question, how much more is it going to cost? They're saying that pay-per-view cards will now be $60 if you have ESPN Plus. So you're actually maybe paying $5 less for pay-per-view. Now it's worth mentioning that each pay-per-view generally happens once a month. I think they usually have about 12 pay-per-views per year. Even sometimes they put a couple in a month. Sometimes they'll have a month without a pay-per-view. So in theory, if you buy every single pay-per-view and you're still paying the $5 for Plus, it still kind of is like $65 a month. But then the Plus essentially is free at that point. But that's if you're buying every pay-per-view, most people aren't going to. As far as how will ESPN Plus offer any kind of bundles or deals, and this is one of the things that Dana White was talking about in his interview with Megan Levy, that now that ESPN Plus has the exclusive distribution, they can offer more deals, and it'll be interesting to see what they do. Maybe for some of the big fights, they might offer some discounts. Maybe they're just going to have the general deal they're talking about right now for every pay-per-view. They're saying yes, right now ESPN is offering new broadcaster or new subscribers 1 year of ESPN Plus and a pay-per-view for the price of $80. So that's 30 more than usual for the yearly price of ESPN. But you could also argue that if you're usually paying $65 for a pay-per-view, now you're paying $80 for a pay-per-view and a year of ESPN Plus. So let's just say you and your friends decide that you want to go over to someone's house and watch the fights, and no one has ESPN Plus. In theory, you're only paying $15 more than you otherwise would have, but now whoever hosts it gets a year of ESPN Plus as well. So in a way, I guess it could be a good deal for you if you host your friends every so often to watch pay-per-views. Now you can get ESPN Plus for free if you can get them to chip in a little bit of extra money. And I don't know that $15 extra is really going to take anyone and convince them not to do this anymore. And plus, after the first time when it's the $80, the next time it'll be $60. So depending on how many pay-per-views you do, eventually it might actually be a little bit cheaper this way than it was otherwise with the $65 per pay-per-view. How does this affect fans outside the U.S.? It's not going to, because this is an American-specific deal. What about watching at sports bars or restaurants? That will stay the same. So the UFC has retained the rights to sell its pay-per-view cards commercially, and that was one of the big concerns when this news first came out, was that a lot of these sports bars don't have ESPN Plus. They don't really have streaming. They just kind of go off of their cable package. So if it was only ESPN Plus, how are they going to cover it? But it looks like the UFC has that figured out already and has that taken care of. So it looks like a lot of the same sports bars you're already going to are still going to have the fights. So that's going to remain unaffected, and that's really important here. Why do they do it? They're saying it's simple. Financially, it's almost certainly a great deal for the UFC. ESPN will pay a license fee on the front end to sell the promotion's pay-per-view cards, and then presumably the UFC will still make a percentage on the pay-per-view back end. It's unclear what the percentage is. And they mentioned in this article too that right now the percentage with DirecTV, or at least with DirecTV before, it was around 50%. So if the UFC sold a card for, I'll say $60 to make it easier, then they'd only get to keep 30 on top, or 30 at the end. You would think that with pay-per-views now they're going to make a larger percentage. So even if they sell a few less pay-per-views because people don't like the situation with the ESPN Plus, the additional money that they're going to be making off of a higher percentage plus the license fee on top of it, even if you sell thousands fewer pay-per-views because you're getting a bigger cut, you still might actually make more money. So in the end, this might actually be a good move for business. And saying, are there any other benefits for the UFC? They're saying yes, the data, and data is a big thing that fans don't consider, but Epstein said it's a key factor. That's actually very true. I work in marketing. Data is a humongous aspect. The more data you can get, the better. It really gives you a lot of information on what customers are doing, what their interests are, what their buying habits are, what sort of things matter to them. Right now, we've seen a lot of interim title fights, and I think that part of that's because when the UFC will do surveys, they'll see that fans like the idea of a title fight, but that's based off of a survey. It's not based off of actual data. But if you can actually start getting some more data on customers or on specific customers, you can actually tell whether or not people care that much about an interim title or not, or whether or not the matchups matter more. So they might actually get some data from this that could potentially teach them, hey, maybe we overestimated the need for the championship belt in every pay-per-view, and we might see fewer interim titles, or maybe the data will say something else. Maybe we'll actually see more interim titles. So I think they might actually be able to put together a product that's more in line with what fans want by having this additional data. So while I think a lot of people might not feel comfortable about their data being captured, I'll just tell you from a marketing standpoint, like when I'm dealing with customer data, I don't give a shit about like an individual customer looking for patterns. So like if I let's talk about like someone who you might know, like Joe Rogan. Like a marketer doesn't look at Joe Rogan as someone who's like, hey, let me learn about Joe Rogan. It's more like, hey, let me learn about customer X who is interested in martial arts and comedy and hunting. Like it's more about customer X than it is about a specific name. So I think for the UFC, they're going to get a lot of good customer data from this, and this could potentially help them grow in the future, and it could help them put together a better product. Isn't it risky to move away from traditional pay-per-view? Sure, it's a risk. That's what they're saying. Theoretically, there's some risk. I think from a practical standpoint, the good news for us, particularly in the U.S., is that Netflix has broken down all of those barriers, as with Hulu and many of the other over-the-top products, and Amazon's a big one. So they're saying at this point, with streaming being as big as it is, the risk is kind of limited and it's not as big as it might seem. How will it affect fighters who have pay-per-view points written in their contracts? It doesn't look like they actually got a comment on this one. Now, what's interesting to me is as far as I remember, pay-per-view points aren't actually percentage points. It's more like if you're a champion and you have pay-per-view points, that means if for every pay-per-view sale beyond 300,000, for example, you might get $2.50 on top of that. Well, if the UFC is making a bigger cut, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be more money for the fighters. And also, if they're getting fewer pay-per-views but more revenue in total, then that pay-per-view point structure of say 250 on every pay-per-view past 300,000 is actually going to cost the UFC less because they're paying their fighters less. So what I'd be interested to see is once this actually like shakes out and they start to see how it works, if managers don't start negotiating for different style pay-per-view points where they actually are arguing for a percentage rather than just that the old model of like the 300,000 and then 250 on top of that. Because if that's the case, then fighters actually are going to lose out on this if they can renegotiate it where it makes a little bit more sense. That'll be good for them. But then also the license fee, and if they are making more money on pay-per-views, it's going to mean more revenue for the company, and it'll be interesting from there. What we've seen with the UFC over time is that as they make more revenue, they generally do pay fighters better, and they have increased fighter wages. But it'll be interesting to see if that continues to increase, and if so, how much more fighters are going to be making now than they were before. And then when they're saying what it means for Fight Pass, Fight Pass is more of a global thing, I think, at this point than it is in America. There are a lot of good combat sports that are on Fight Pass, but right now, Fight Pass, it's almost like a shittier version of Flow, to be honest. Like, Flow doesn't have as good of MMA as Fight Pass does. The kickboxing, I guess, isn't at the same level, but Flow is much better with jiu-jitsu, and in a way, those two are kind of competitors now, whereas Fight Pass isn't really as much of a direct competitor with ESPN Plus. Although, to be fair, why would they be competing with a business partner? It doesn't necessarily make the most sense.